The Seine lay in silence, a black ribbon through Paris, its surface broken only by the faint glow of lamps quivering on the embankment. The fog clung low, muffling the voices of the night, while the shutters of cafes and tabacs rattled under a damp wind. At this hour the city lived in shadows, and only the measured footsteps of the police commissaire betrayed the weight of vigilance. Jules Maigret, his heavy overcoat drawn close, pipe clamped between his teeth, moved without hurry. He had walked these streets for decades, the stones themselves seeming to yield their secrets in the way the mist curled around corners, in the sound of water dripping from a gutter, in the hush that fell when a door was shut a second too quickly. It was here, among the ordinary, that the extraordinary so often emerged. Tonight there was already a whisper of it, a shiver in the fog, a hint that a story darker than the Paris night had just begun. If you find yourself drawn into this world of smoke-filled rooms, rain-slicked boulevards, and mysteries that unfold like whispered confessions, then stay with us. These stories live best when shared. So take a moment to subscribe, to leave a trace of your presence, to return when the lamps are once again lit and the shadows begin to stir. The fog that morning seemed reluctant to lift, as though Paris itself wished to hide its face. The great stone arches of the Pont Neuf were half lost in a damp veil, and the Seine, sluggish and swollen, carried barges that slipped past almost without sound. At the Quai des Orfèvres, where the walls sweated with cold, a boy sat waiting, his back pressed against the wood-panelled bench outside the office door. He could not have been more than 14 or 15. His clothes, though not ragged, bore the grime of travel, and his shoes carried clumps of dried mud, as if he had walked along tracks or across fields in the dark. Inside, the air smelled of damp wool, old paper, and tobacco. Maigret arrived later than usual, his heavy coat beaded with droplets, his pipe already drawing faintly. He greeted the concierge with his customary nod, exchanged a few words with Lucas, who was bent over a typewritten report, and only then noticed the boy. The child lifted his head quickly, then just as quickly dropped it again, his fingers twisting the cap he held in his hands. There was nothing dramatic in his appearance, no bruises, no torn clothing. Yet he seemed to carry a silence that was heavier than any wound. "Since when has he been here?" Maigret asked, pausing before the door. "An hour, maybe more," Lucas replied, rubbing at his eyes. "Wouldn't speak to anyone, just asked to see you." The commissaire did not like such requests. The world was full of petty tricksters and desperate souls who believed an audience with him would solve all their troubles. Yet there was something in the boy's posture, the stiff way he sat, as though bracing against some invisible blow, that stirred a flicker of unease. Maigret opened the door to his office. The familiar surroundings greeted him, the big desk scarred by years of elbows and ink stains, the two chairs opposite, the stove that coughed occasionally when the draught misbehaved. He motioned the boy inside. The child obeyed without a word, perching on the edge of the chair. He kept his gaze fixed on the floor, the cap still twisting between his hands. His lips parted once, twice, but no sound emerged. "Well?" Maigret said gently, seating himself, pipe stem between his teeth. "You asked for me." The boy nodded. His Adam's apple bobbed in his thin throat. Finally, in a voice scarcely louder than a whisper, he spoke. I know something." The words hung in the smoky air, as fragile as the mist outside. Maigret did not lean forward, did not press him. He had long ago learned that silence, when properly placed, drew out more truth than interrogation. He simply waited, eyes half-lidded, pipe glowing faintly. The boy's fingers fumbled with his cap, turning it over and over. "If I tell, they'll find me. They'll know." "Who?" Maigret asked, as if in casual conversation. The boy flinched at the question. His eyes darted to the door, to the window, to the corners of the room, as though shadows themselves might betray him. He did not answer. Instead, he swallowed hard and lowered his voice to a thread. "There was a man last night at the station. He shouldn't have been there." "Which station?" The boy pressed his lips together. A muscle in his cheek twitched. Then he shook his head violently. Maigret drew deeply on his pipe, filling the air with smoke. He watched the boy without judgment, noting the pallor of his skin, the restless flicker of his eyes. He thought of countless children he had seen, runaways, pickpockets, orphans hardened by the streets. This one was different. Fear lived in him like a second skin, but it was not the ordinary fear of hunger or beatings. It was something older, darker, as though he carried within him the echo of another man's crime. "You've eaten?" Maigret asked suddenly. The boy blinked. "No." "Lucas!" Maigret called through the door. "Send for some bread and coffee." The boy's eyes widened as though even this kindness might be a trap. He shifted uneasily but did not flee. When the food arrived, he ate with quick, furtive bites, like an animal expecting the bowl to be snatched away. All the while, Maigret smoked, saying nothing. He knew the words would come when the stomach was no longer empty. And indeed, after the last crumb had vanished, the boy set down his cup and whispered, "I saw him with a trunk." The commissaire's eyebrows rose slightly. "A trunk?" The boy nodded. He was carrying it to the end of the platform. No one else saw. No one wanted to. Which platform? Again that stubborn silence. The boy pressed his fists against his knees. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the chill. Maigret felt the familiar tug of the hunt. A trunk on a platform, a boy who claimed to have seen too much, a silence thick as fog. There was no case yet, no report filed, and yet the scent of something unfinished hung in the air. He leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. "Listen to me," he said, his voice calm, almost fatherly. "No one here will harm you. If there is danger, it is my business to face it, not yours. But I cannot help unless you speak." The boy's eyes filled suddenly, though no tears fell. He shook his head once more. "Not yet," he murmured. "Not now." And before Maigret could reply, he rose from the chair, clutching his cap, and moved toward the door. Lucas appeared in the corridor, startled. "Where are you going?" The boy brushed past without a word, disappearing into the fog. His footsteps rang briefly on the stone, then faded. For a long moment, Maigret remained seated, pipe gone out, staring at the empty chair. He felt the peculiar weight that always accompanied the first stirrings of a mystery, the sense that something vital had brushed against him and then slipped away. There was no crime, no body, nothing but a boy's whisper. Yet he knew with the certainty of instinct that he had just glimpsed the edge of a shadow spreading wider than anyone wished to admit. He rose at last, shrugging into his coat. Outside, the fog swallowed him too, and the Seine flowed on, indifferent, while somewhere in the city a trunk waited in silence, heavy with its secret. The fog lingered well into the afternoon, clinging to the river as if it feared dispersing. On the quays, bargemen cursed softly at invisible obstacles, and the hum of traffic was muffled into a kind of whispering murmur. Paris seemed wrapped in a shroud, its movements slowed, its gestures indistinct. In such weather, people turned inward, voices carried less, and faces behind cafe windows appeared like blurred portraits. Maigret had not intended to follow the boy's trail immediately. He disliked the notion of chasing shadows, of running breathless after something that might dissolve into nothing. Yet he knew his own temperament too well. The boy's silence had lodged itself in him like a pebble in a shoe, Every time he drew on his pipe, the image of the thin hands twisting the cap returned, the whisper of the trunk on a platform repeating in his ear. By the time he stepped outside, the direction of his walk was inevitable. He moved without hurry, heavy-shouldered, the collar of his coat turned up against the damp. Past the Pont Saint-Michel, the fog thickened again, and lamps glowed dimly, yellow halos in the whiteness. On a corner, a cafe beckoned with its warmth. He knew it at once, one of those small establishments where mornings begin with glasses of mark and the evenings end in a haze of tobacco and muttered confidences. The boy's kind of place, or rather the place where men who might frighten such a boy would sit unnoticed. The door creaked open as Maigret entered. Inside, the atmosphere was close, thick with smoke and the stale sweetness of spilled wine. A handful of patrons sat scattered about, a man in a bowler hat hunched over his glass, 2 women whispering at the counter, an old fellow asleep with his nose nearly in his beer. The stove in the corner radiated uneven heat, its iron belly glowing faintly. At Maigret's entrance, heads turned, but only for an instant. It was not uncommon for him to be recognized in such places, and recognition usually bred silence. He moved to a table near the wall, ordered a calvados, and let his eyes wander. There is an art to observation that is not in staring but in appearing absent. Maigret smoked quietly, gaze half fixed on the window where fog pressed like frosted glass. And slowly, as always, the silence of the cafe began to reveal its texture. The whispers of the women ceased altogether when he looked their way. The man in the bowler hat pretended to read the racing page, but the corner of the newspaper trembled slightly. From time to time, someone glanced at the door, as if expecting another arrival. The boy had been here. Maigret felt it as surely as he felt the damp in his coat. The silence of the room was not natural. It was shaped by knowledge, by the memory of a face too young, too frightened. He had interrupted something by merely existing in the same air. When the patron approached with his drink, he asked casually, "You see a boy here this morning? Thin, muddy shoes, cap in his hands?" The woman's eyes flickered, then slid away. She set down the glass without answer, retreating to the counter. Maigret did not pursue her. He drank slowly, savouring the harsh apple spirit, letting the silence swell again. The truth would emerge, as it always did, not in confessions, but in gestures, in the way people shifted on their chairs when a name was spoken. He tapped his pipe against the table, refilled it, and said into the haze, "Strange weather to be walking from the station with a trunk." The effect was immediate. The man in the bowler hat stiffened, his glass arrested halfway to his lips. The women exchanged a glance too quick to be casual. Even the old fellow stirred faintly as though his sleep had thinned. Maigret allowed himself the faintest of smiles. He had not accused, had not questioned, and yet the room had betrayed itself. The patronne returned, wiping her hands on her apron. "We don't know anything about trunks, monsieur," she said sharply, though he had not addressed her. "No, of course not," Maigret replied mildly, puffing smoke. "Only a boy mentioned it, a boy too frightened to finish his sentence." Now the silence was heavy, oppressive. The stove ticked as coal shifted within. Somewhere outside, a horse's hooves clattered faintly on wet cobbles. Inside, no one moved. The commissaire drained his glass, rose slowly, and adjusted his coat. He made no threats, issued no orders. At the door, he turned once more, scanning the faces. None met his gaze, yet all seemed carved in stone, as though waiting for something to pass. On the street, the fog swallowed him again. He stood for a moment, filling his pipe, letting the warmth of the spirit sink through him. There was no doubt now. The boy's story was real, even if half told. That cafe had been his refuge, and yet also his danger. The silence of its patrons spoke louder than a shouted confession. A carriage rattled by, its lanterns glowing faintly. Maigret set off along the quay, heading nowhere in particular, only letting instinct draw him. His thoughts wandered. What man carried a trunk at night, unobserved but for the eyes of a boy? What weight demanded such secrecy? And why had the boy come to him, of all people, rather than the priest, the gendarme, or simply running away into the countryside? He walked until the fog thinned, and the outlines of Notre Dame loomed above him, the towers dissolving into mist. He stood on the bridge, watching the river flow beneath, carrying its secrets toward the sea. The boy's face returned to him, pale and tense, the whisper still lodged in his ear. It was not a case yet. Nothing could be written in a report, nothing filed. And yet Maigret felt more certain than ever. Somewhere in the city, a crime already existed, hidden beneath silence and fear. And he had brushed against the first ripple of it in a cafe where faces turned to stone. He tamped down his pipe, exhaled into the fog, and turned back toward the Quai des Orfèvres. Behind him, the cafe shutters closed, one after another, as though the place itself wished to disappear. The boy had vanished into the mist, but his presence lingered everywhere, in every glance avoided, in every silence held too long. The city was beginning to whisper, and Maigret, pipe in hand, was listening. Night descended without ceremony, the fog thickening until it seemed to weave itself into the very fabric of the city. The lamps that lined the quay glowed dimly, halos blurred and uncertain, their light swallowed almost as soon as it was born. The cobbles shone wet though no rain had fallen. It was as if Paris itself perspired under the weight of the mist, exhaling its secrets in vapours that clung to every doorway and alley. Maigret walked with the unhurried gait that belonged to him alone, his hands deep in the pockets of his heavy overcoat, his pipe stem jutting from the corner of his mouth. The events of the day clung to him no less stubbornly than the fog. The boy's whisper of a trunk, the silence in the cafe that spoke more loudly than any declaration. None of it yet formed a case, but together they had begun to gnaw at him. He did not deceive himself. Instinct, that mixture of experience and something less tangible, had already taken hold. It pulled him forward as surely as the current pulled the Seine. A clock struck somewhere, muffled and indistinct. He turned into a narrow street that wound between shuttered buildings, their facades streaked with moisture. It was there that he first noticed it. The echo of his own steps seemed doubled, a fraction out of time. He paused, pipe smoke curling before him. Silence returned instantly, heavy, expectant. When he moved again, the echo returned, softer, but undeniable. Someone was following. He did not turn at once. He had been followed often enough to know that sudden movements startled the truth away. Instead, he continued at his measured pace, eyes half closed, head slightly bowed, as though lost in thought. The echo persisted, sometimes near, sometimes farther, as if whoever shadowed him was uncertain of the distance. The fog made everything treacherous. At one corner, a figure loomed briefly, then vanished when Maigret turned his head. A cat darted across the street, claws clicking on the stones, and for a moment he wondered if his imagination had exaggerated the pursuit. But the rhythm of those steps returned again and again, as insistent as a pulse. He chose his route deliberately now, twisting through alleys where the gas lamps were fewer, where the fog pooled thick as milk. The steps followed. He stopped suddenly beneath an archway. The silence was immediate, but not innocent. He struck a match, shielding the flame against the damp, and relit his pipe. In the flare of light, he thought he saw a shape dissolve into the mist farther down. It was not fear that gripped him, but a sharpening of the senses, a hunter's awareness. Whoever followed him had purpose, but not yet courage. That was dangerous in its own way. Fearful men could kill as quickly as desperate ones. At the Place Dauphine, the cafes were closing. Chairs scraped against stone, shutters slammed. A waiter, sleeves rolled, glanced at him, and then quickly away. Somewhere close by, a door shut too quietly, as though someone wished not to be heard. Maigret moved on, past the river, past the glow of the bridge, into streets that smelled of damp wood and stale beer. The footsteps came again. Quicker this time, closer. He stopped abruptly and turned. For a heartbeat, the fog thinned. He saw the outline of a man, tall, shoulders hunched, a hat pulled low. The figure froze, then melted back into the whiteness. "Good evening," Maigret called, voice even, carrying through the mist. No answer. Only the sound of retreating steps swallowed almost at once. He did not pursue. He stood, pipe smoke mingling with fog, listening until even silence seemed to hum. Then he resumed his walk, slower now, thoughtful. The city was not empty, it never was. Somewhere nearby, others moved unseen. A carriage passed, its driver hunched against the damp. A woman crossed herself before a closed chapel door. Life went on in pockets, yet around him the sense of pursuit lingered. He turned toward the river once more. The Seine slid dark and secretive, its banks veiled in mist. He leaned on the parapet, staring into the shifting greyness. The boy's pale face rose again in his memory. Was it the same shadow that had followed him? Or another, drawn not to him but to the child who had dared to speak? The sound of footsteps returned, faint but deliberate, behind him. He turned quickly this time, but saw nothing, only fog and the glisten of wet cobbles. Yet he knew someone had measured his movements, had chosen to stalk rather than confront. He tamped down his pipe, sparks glowing briefly. His expression was unreadable, but within him the pattern formed. A boy, a trunk, a silence heavy as lead, and now the footsteps in the fog. Each piece alone was nothing. Together they hinted at a story written in shadows, waiting to be dragged into light. He left the river, heading back toward the Quai des Orfèvres. The fog accompanied him like a conspirator, thick and impenetrable, muting the city's noises until all that remained was the echo of his own steps, and those other footsteps, sometimes near, sometimes vanishing, woven into the rhythm of the night. When at last he reached his office, the concierge was dozing by the stove, and the corridors were quiet. Maigret paused in his doorway, pipe extinguished, the taste of the fog still on his lips. He had brought nothing tangible back with him, only the certainty of pursuit, the knowledge that invisible eyes had fixed themselves upon him. He sat heavily in his chair, staring at the empty space where the boy had sat that morning. Somewhere out there, beyond the veil of mist, truths were waiting, restless and unwilling to remain hidden much longer. And in the silence of the office, Maigret thought he could still hear it, footsteps in the fog, keeping pace with him, even here. The following morning broke with a weak light, grey and uncertain, struggling through the misted panes of the Quai des Orfèvres. The Seine had not shed its fog. It rolled in languid coils along the embankments, muffling the horns of the river traffic. In the offices, the routine of police work stirred with weary regularity. Clerks scratching at ledgers, telephones ringing without urgency, the smell of inkwells mixing with tobacco. Maigret entered with his habitual heaviness, overcoat damp from the walk, bowler hat pushed back on his head. He paused at the stove to warm his hands, exchanged a nod with Janvier, who was already buried in reports, and let himself into his office. The boy's absence was felt like a hollow space waiting to be filled. He had not returned, yet his whisper clung to the room as though it had been soaked into the wood of the furniture. On the desk, among the scattered papers and unopened envelopes, lay a telegram. Its thin yellow sheet seemed to glow faintly in the dim light, as if announcing its importance. Maigret unfolded it with deliberate slowness, pipe clenched between his teeth, eyes narrowing as he read. It was from a small provincial station in the north, an unremarkable place known more for its sugar beet fields and a Sunday market than for any notoriety. The station master reported, in clipped official phrasing, that a trunk had been found abandoned on a siding during the night. Its presence was suspicious, not merely for being left unattended, but because it bore stains that no rain could account for. The gendarmes had opened it in the early hours. The telegram did not state directly what they had discovered, but the final words, "Request assistance, possible homicide," were enough to send a chill through the commissaire's broad frame. He read it again, slower this time. A trunk. A boy's whisper. The two threads twined together with unsettling precision. The station named in the telegram might well have been the very one the boy had hinted at, the one he had refused to name. And now the silence was broken not by his lips, but by cold official words tapped out on a wire. Lucas entered without knocking, as was his habit, carrying the morning's newspapers under his arm. "Anything new, Chief?" he asked. Maigret held up the telegram without a word. Lucas read quickly, his face tightening. "So it's real then. The boy wasn't just imagining." "No," Maigret said, tamping the ash from his pipe. "He wasn't imagining." The newspapers, always hungry, were already sniffing. Their front pages bore gossip about disturbances near the Gare du Nord, though nothing concrete. One claimed a woman had screamed in the night, another that a railway porter had disappeared. None mentioned a trunk, yet the air of rumour was thick, like smoke seeping under a door. By mid-morning, Maigret had made his decision. He would travel north, see the trunk with his own eyes. He could not allow second-hand reports to shape his understanding. He needed the smell of the place, the tone of voices, the gestures of those who discovered it. The truth was not in the telegram, nor in the lines of type set by journalists. It was in the silence between words, the looks exchanged in the station's waiting room, the nervous shifting of feet on a damp platform. He summoned Janvier and Lucas, gave instructions in his slow, measured way. One would remain to handle the flood of inquiries certain to come from the press. The other would trace the boy discreetly through schools, cafes, and boarding houses. But he himself would go to the provinces. He needed the soil under his shoes, the air of that town in his lungs. The train left in the early afternoon, pulling reluctantly out of the Gare du Nord. The carriages rocked with the rhythm of iron on iron, the windows streaked with condensation. Maigret settled heavily into his seat, pipe smoke curling about him, watching the countryside emerge through the fog like half-finished sketches. Fields glazed with moisture, barns huddled against the cold, lonely figures trudging along muddy paths. He dozed briefly, the sway of the train soothing him, but the image of the boy jolted him awake more than once, as if to remind him why he travelled. At the provincial station, dusk was already descending. The platform smelled of coal dust and wet wood. A gendarme in a stiff greatcoat waited, cap pulled low, moustache bristling. He saluted with awkward formality and led the commissaire toward the siding, where the trunk had been discovered. It stood in a goods shed, its black leather sides scarred and battered from use. The lock was broken, the lid propped open. Inside lay the unmistakable form of a man, folded in on itself, the limbs arranged with a grotesque care that made Maigret's stomach tighten. The face was turned away, but the hair was dark, matted, and the hands bore the rough calluses of labor. Death had stiffened him into silence. The station master, pale and fidgeting, explained in halting sentences how the trunk had been noticed by a porter during the night, how no ticket matched its label, how it had been carried awkwardly by a man no one seemed able to describe clearly. Each account contradicted the next. He was tall, he was short, he wore a hat, he carried none. It was the same with all provincial testimonies, too many words, not enough truth. Maigret asked no questions at first. He stood smoking, eyes half-lidded, as though gazing not at the body, but at the echoes surrounding it. He let the silence grow uncomfortable until the station-master began to sweat, and the gendarme shifted on his boots. Only then did he speak, low and deliberate. "Who saw the boy?" They stared at him, startled. "What boy, commissaire?" "There was a boy, thin, muddy shoes, cap in his hands. He saw something." The gendarme shook his head. "Not here." No one like that reported. Maigret's pipe smoke drifted upward, curling against the beams of the shed. He said nothing more, yet within him the conviction hardened. The boy had known. He had known of this trunk, of the man inside, and had carried that knowledge across Paris to the Quai des Orfèvres. He had known too much for his age, and fear had sealed his mouth. That night, Maigret took a room at the modest inn across from the station. The bed sagged, the wallpaper peeled in damp corners, and the lamp smoked badly. He sat long into the night, pipe glowing in the gloom, listening to the distant shunting of trains. Outside, the town slept in provincial silence, broken only by the barking of a dog. In his mind he replayed the boy's whisper, the cafe's sudden hush, the echoing footsteps in the fog. The threads were drawing tighter, but not yet into a pattern he could see clearly. Still he felt it. The heart of the case was not in this station, nor in the trunk, nor even in the dead man. It was in the boy who had dared to bring a fragment of truth to his office and then fled into the mist. Toward dawn, as he finally stretched on the bed, one thought repeated itself with the rhythm of a train wheel. He must find the boy again. The trunk was only the beginning. The boy was the key. The return to Paris was marked, not by triumph, but by the same damp fog that had accompanied his departure. The train rolled into the Gare du Nord under a sky the colour of tarnished pewter, its platforms glistening as if the stones themselves sweated unease. Passengers hurried past with bundles clutched close, their footsteps sharp in the vaulted hall, but Maigret moved with his usual deliberate heaviness, bowler hat tilted forward, pipe clamped at an angle in his mouth. The trunk in the provinces had given him no clarity, only confirmation of something he already suspected. A boy's whisper was no childish fancy. Yet clarity had not come. By the time he crossed Boulevard Richard-Lenoir, dusk had already dimmed the rows of apartment windows. The faint smell of roasting chestnuts hung in the air, mingling with the acrid smoke of coal stoves. He climbed the stairs of his building with a weariness that clung to his bones more than to his body. Madame Maigret opened the door before he had touched the handle, her face framed in the soft light of the hallway lamp. She had been waiting, as she always did, listening for his tread on the stairs. "You're late," she said simply, with none of the reproach that might have been in another woman's voice. Her eyes, dark and steady, lingered on his face, reading in its heaviness all that he did not speak. He shrugged off his coat, hung it carefully on the peg, and inhaled the warmth of their home, the faint aroma of beef simmering, the smell of clean linen, the ordinary domestic peace that contrasted so sharply with the streets outside. It was here, in this small apartment, with its worn furniture and lace curtains, that he could almost believe life was simple. Yet tonight, The shadow of the boy followed him across the threshold. They sat at the table. The lamp threw a mellow glow over the white cloth, the bowls of steaming soup, the loaf of bread. Madame Maigret poured wine into his glass, her hands calm, but her eyes watchful. He ate in silence, spoon moving mechanically, pipe resting on the edge of his plate. She waited, patient as ever, until at last he sighed and leaned back, shoulders sinking heavily. "There's a boy?" he said. "A boy?" He nodded. "Came to the office, said almost nothing, but enough. He's afraid." Her brow furrowed. "What sort of boy?" "The kind who carries too much in his silence." He spoke of a trunk, and in the provinces. He let the words trail off, unwilling to bring the full weight of the corpse into their dining room. Yet she understood. She always did. Her eyes darkened, and she set her hands on the tablecloth, fingertips pressing lightly as though grounding herself. "You're worried for him," she said softly. Maigret lit his pipe again, the smoke curling upward in slow spirals. He did not answer directly. Worry was not a word he often used, but in his silence she read the truth. She had lived beside him too long not to know. "The neighbours spoke of a boy," she went on. "This afternoon, when I was at the grocer's, a thin one with a cap, standing in the doorway across the street. They said he looked lost. Could it be the same?" A faint tightening crossed Maigret's face. The boy had been near their home. It was possible, even likely. Fear drove children not only into hiding, but toward figures they believed might protect them. If he had followed Maigret to Richard Lenoir, then the case had already breached the fragile barrier between work and home. Madame Maigret's calm expression did not disguise her unease. "He looked hungry," she added. "The neighbours said he vanished when they turned to look twice." Maigret puffed silently, staring into the glow of the lamp. He imagined the boy standing in the doorway, cap twisted in his hands, eyes darting. The thought of him wandering the streets unprotected tightened something in his chest. In Paris, shadows had a way of swallowing children whole. Madame Maigret reached across the table and touched his hand. "You can't bring every stray into your office," she said gently. "But if he comes again, perhaps he should eat here. At least once. A child shouldn't live only on fear." He turned his hand slightly, allowing her fingers to rest against his own. The warmth steadied him. For a moment he saw the case not through the lens of procedure or duty, but through her eyes. A boy, thin and frightened, more child than witness, carrying something too heavy for his small shoulders. It was not only a matter of crime, but of humanity. The evening passed quietly. After the plates were cleared, she mended a shirt by the lamp, her needle flashing in the glow, while he smoked in the armchair, staring at the darkened window. The fog pressed outside, hiding the boulevard, muting the sound of carriages. Inside, the room was a haven, yet even here the boy's presence hovered like a ghost. When at last they retired, Maigret lay awake longer than usual, pipe cold on the nightstand. Madame Maigret's steady breathing filled the silence, but his mind returned again and again to the image of a child on the threshold, uncertain, waiting. He had seen hardened criminals weep, had stared into eyes emptied by crime, yet nothing unsettled him more than the thought of innocence dragged too soon into darkness. In the morning, when he left for the Quai des Orfèvres, Madame Maigret walked with him to the door. Her hand lingered on his arm. "Promise me you'll find him," she said simply. He did not answer with words. He only nodded once, firmly, and stepped into the fog-bound boulevard. The weight of her concern walked with him, heavier than the overcoat on his shoulders. He knew then that the case had ceased to be merely professional. It had entered his home, touched his wife's quiet heart, and become something he could not abandon until the boy was safe, or until the silence was broken. The lodging house on the edge of Montmartre stood on a narrow street that smelled of damp stone and frying onions. Its facade, with peeling paint and crooked shutters, bore the weary air of too many tenants who had come and gone without leaving a trace. A pale sign above the door announced chambre meublée, though its letters were faded almost to invisibility. Maigret paused at the threshold, pipe smoke rising in lazy curls, studying the doorway as though it might confess something before he entered. Inside, the air was close and carried a faint odour of cabbage cooked too long. A narrow corridor stretched toward a stairway whose carpet had long since surrendered to the tread of boots. The landlady, a woman with grey hair coiled tightly and a sharp mouth, appeared from behind a counter. She recognized him at once. Few in Paris failed to know the commissaire, especially in such quarters where rumour travelled faster than rent payments. "You're looking for someone?" she asked, voice half defensive, half curious. "A boy," Maigret replied. "Thin, cap in his hands. He may have come here." Her eyes flickered, an instant too long, too noticeable. She shrugged. "We have many tenants, boys, men, families sometimes. People come, people go." He said nothing, only filled his pipe with deliberate care. The silence stretched, heavy as lead. Finally, she gestured toward the staircase. "Perhaps upstairs. Room on the second floor. Belonged to a man who left quickly. I don't ask questions, monsieur." The stairs creaked under his weight. The corridor above was dim, the single lamp flickering as if gas were short. Doors lined the hall, each with its keyhole like a watching eye. At the end stood a door slightly ajar. From within came the smell of dust and stale tobacco. The room was small, almost mean. A narrow bed pushed against the wall, a chair missing a leg propped against the table, a washstand with a cracked jug. At first glance, nothing marked it different from 100 such rooms Maigret had seen. But in the corner stood a trunk, black, iron-banded, its lock gleamed dully in the light. Unlike the battered furniture, the trunk was in good condition, almost too good for the surroundings. He crossed the floor slowly, each board complaining beneath his boots. He touched the lid. Cold, the lock was intact. He tried the handle, firm, resisting. A faint shiver passed through him. It was not the trunk in the provinces, broken open to reveal its secret. This one still guarded its silence, yet the boy's pale face flashed in his mind, and he knew instinctively that the two were bound. Behind him, the landlady hovered in the doorway, twisting her apron in her hands. "It's just a trunk," she said quickly. "Tenants leave things behind all the time." Maigret turned his head slowly, pipe clenched in his teeth. "Whose trunk?" She hesitated. "A man. Tall, wore a dark coat. Paid rent for 2 weeks, then left after 3 days. No forwarding address." The commissaire's gaze lingered on her until she shifted uneasily. "He said someone would come for it. That was weeks ago." The silence thickened. Maigret knelt, running his thick fingers along the edges of the trunk. No dust lay upon it. Someone had touched it recently. He straightened, eyes narrowing. "The boy has seen this trunk." Her lips pressed together. She looked away. "I don't know anything about boys." He moved past her without another word, down the stairs, out into the street where the fog still pressed against the buildings. Yet the image of the locked trunk followed him, heavy as if he carried it on his shoulders. The boy's whisper, the corpse in the provinces, and now this silent container in Montmartre, they formed a pattern whose lines were beginning to show, faint but unmistakable. That evening he returned with Janvier. The younger inspector carried a crowbar. Together they climbed the narrow stair, the landlady wringing her hands behind them. The corridor was silent, the doors of other tenants closed tight. When Janvier forced the lock, the sound echoed through the building like a gunshot. The lid creaked open. Inside lay no body this time, only clothes, carefully folded, though of different sizes and styles as if belonging to several men. Beneath them, a scattering of papers, receipts, railway tickets, envelopes without addresses. And at the very bottom, a child's scarf, woolen, worn thin, still carrying the faint scent of smoke and cold air. Maigret lifted it carefully. The boy's silence, his trembling hands, his refusal to speak, it all surged back with cruel clarity. This scarf belonged to him, or to someone close enough to wound him deeply. Janvier looked at his chief, waiting, but Maigret said nothing. He folded the scarf again, replaced it gently in the trunk, and closed the lid. Some truths could not be dragged into the open all at once. They had to be coaxed, like shadows lured by light. On the walk back down the hill, the lamps flickered against the fog. Janvier asked, in a low voice, "Do you think the boy will come back to us?" Maigret puffed slowly on his pipe. "He will, because he has no one else." They walked in silence, boots striking damp cobbles. Paris seemed to lean closer around them, the fog pressing like a conspirator. Somewhere in the city, the boy moved through the night, frightened and alone, his scarf missing from his shoulders. And Maigret knew with grim certainty that every step now drew him deeper into the heart of a mystery that had only begun to unfold. By the next morning, the city itself seemed restless. The fog had lifted slightly, revealing a Paris that was damp and grey, its slate roofs glistening with last night's moisture, its boulevards streaked with puddles. The kiosks were open early, their racks heavy with newspapers, each headline shouting in bold letters of unease. It was not yet a case the police had acknowledged, but the press had scented blood, as it always did. "Trunk mystery in the north," cried one paper, with a sketch of a railway carriage and a shadowy figure bending over luggage. Another hinted at the child witness, though no official word had ever been given about a boy. A more sensational sheet printed in red ink, the question, "Is Paris harbouring a killer?" None of them named names, but all hinted, speculated, invented, and in their hunger for detail, they had already given the case a shape larger than reality. At the Quai des Orfèvres, the atmosphere was taut. Reporters swarmed the steps, their notebooks ready, fountain pens scratching as soon as a uniform emerged. They shouted questions. "Commissaire, is it true the body was mutilated? Is it connected to the café in Saint-Michel? Has the boy been found?" The words struck like blows, one after another, while shutters clicked, and the murmur of gossip grew louder than the measured tones of police procedure. Maigret pushed through them with his usual immovable calm, his broad figure parting the crowd without effort. He gave no answers, no denials. To speak would be to feed their appetite. Silence, heavy and implacable, was the only tool he trusted. Inside, the offices were thick with the smell of tobacco and damp overcoats. Lucas, sleeves rolled, looked up from his desk with a grimace. "And they've invented half the case for us," he muttered, tossing a copy of Le Petit Parisien onto the blotter. "If the boy wasn't afraid before, he will be now." Maigret settled heavily into his chair, pipe clenched in his teeth, smoke curling upward in slow spirals. He did not need to read the article. He knew its rhythm, the speculations dressed as facts, the anonymous sources, the invented dialogues. What mattered was not their accuracy, but their effect. The city would soon be buzzing with rumors, names would be whispered in cafes, glances exchanged in markets. Fear would spread faster than truth. In the afternoon he ventured into the streets. At the corner cafes, men bent over newspapers, tapping the columns with their fingers as though each word were gospel. Women at the grocer's whispered about the trunk, about a boy seen running through alleys, about a commissaire who carried secrets too heavy even for him. Everywhere he went, silence fell when he entered. Eyes turned away. Then whispers resumed as soon as his heavy step receded. The press had made him part of the story. It was no longer a crime, but Maigret's case. His name in print gave the affair a certain inevitability, and yet he had so little to hold in his hand, only a corpse in a provincial trunk, a boy's whisper, a scarf at the bottom of another locked chest. Everything else was mist, rumour, speculation. At home that evening, Madame Maigret placed the newspaper gently on the table beside his plate. She did not comment, but her lips pressed into a thin line. He read the headline without interest, folded the paper away, and concentrated on the soup she had set before him. Yet he felt her eyes upon him, weighing his silence. "They'll make monsters of us all if they continue," she said at last. "That poor child, if he reads even one of these lines." She did not finish. Maigret puffed his pipe slowly, staring into the glow of the lamp. He imagined the boy crouched in some doorway, cap pulled low, seeing his own shadow stretched across the front page of a newspaper. The fear that had already sealed his lips would now become terror. The city itself was hunting him, though it did not know his name. The next day the rumours grew wilder. One sheet claimed the victim in the trunk was an Austrian nobleman, another that he was a circus performer. A rival paper insisted it was the work of a foreign gang. In cafes, men swore they had seen the trunk carried through the Gare du Nord, others that they had helped lift it into a carriage. Paris thrives on invention. The fog of speculation was thicker now than the weather outside. Maigret moved through it with his deliberate calm, gathering fragments not from print, but from faces. The café near the river, once silent, now refused even his presence. The landlady in Montmartre, who had twisted her apron nervously, had vanished from her post, replaced by a cousin who claimed ignorance. And always, the boy's absence pressed harder, as if the city's growing noise had driven him deeper into hiding. By evening, when the offices quieted and the typewriters fell still, Maigret stood by the window of his office. Below, the river slid dark and indifferent, reflecting the lamps in broken streaks. Behind him lay a stack of newspapers, their headlines loud and brash. Before him, the fog returned, muting the city into silence. Somewhere in that silence, the boy moved, nameless, faceless to the crowd, but vivid in the commissaire's mind. He tamped his pipe against the sill, sparks falling into the night. The rumours of the press were like smoke, thick, choking, impossible to grasp. But within the haze, a shape remained constant, undeniable. The boy knew, the boy had seen. And until his silence broke, the city would drown itself in lies. The train swayed gently as it pushed northward through the flat fields. Morning had broken pale and cold, the sun a weak disk behind veils of cloud, unable to warm the frost that glazed the ditches and hedgerows. Maigret sat heavily in his compartment, pipe between his teeth, coat collar turned up against the draughts that slipped in through the imperfect seals of the window. Opposite him, a farmer with cracked hands dozed, his cap pulled over his eyes. The rhythm of the wheels on the rails, steady, hypnotic, carried the commissaire back into the heart of the provinces, toward a station whose name was scarcely known outside its region, and yet had become the axis of the case. He had read the telegrams again before leaving Paris, though he could recite their words by memory. The abandoned trunk, the body folded inside, the confusion of the station staff, their contradictory testimonies. Now, after days of rumour in the capital, he sought the silence of provincial reality. To Maigret, truth lay not in the loud shouts of newspapers, but in the hesitant gestures of those who had actually been present. The train slowed with a long sigh of steam. The provincial station emerged from the mist, a modest building of yellowed stone, its clock frozen a few minutes behind, its benches damp with morning dew. A porter in a frayed uniform wheeled a barrow across the platform, glancing curiously at the arriving passengers. Few disembarked here. Most only saw the station blur past their windows. Maigret stepped onto the platform, pipe smoke curling from his lips. The air smelled of coal dust, wet earth, and the faint sweetness of manure carried from nearby fields. A gendarme in a too large greatcoat approached, saluted awkwardly, and led him toward the office. Inside, the station-master waited, a balding man with spectacles perched low on his nose, his expression tense, his hands perpetually smoothing the ledger before him. "We did what we could, commissaire," he began nervously. "But it was in the middle of the night. The trunk, it appeared as if from nowhere. One of the porters swears he saw a tall man leave it near the siding, but another insists there were two. Their memories are not precise." Maigret listened in silence, pipe glowing faintly. He had learned long ago that contradictions were more revealing than clarity. The truth often slipped between versions, appearing only in the details others wished to smooth away. "Where was it opened?" he asked. They led him to a shed at the far end of the siding. The trunk stood empty now, its lid propped wide, the interior lined with rough wood. Yet the smell lingered, an unmistakable odour of decay, sweet and nauseating, clinging to the boards despite the cold. Maigret bent, running his thick fingers along the edges. A trace of dark stain had seeped into the grain. He did not need to ask more. The corpse had been removed, carried to the town morgue, but its presence still haunted the container. He straightened, eyes narrowing, as he studied the ground outside. The frost had preserved footprints, blurred now by the comings and goings of curious onlookers, but one impression caught his attention, smaller, lighter, as though left by a child's shoe. He stared at it for a long time, pipe clenched between his teeth. The boy again, always the boy. Even here, 200 kilometers from Paris, his ghost remained. In the waiting room, Maigret sat heavily on a bench and ordered coffee. The stove smoked, and the walls were damp. A few townsfolk loitered, their eyes darting curiously toward the stranger with the pipe. They whispered among themselves, voices low, glances sharp. He caught fragments: the trunk, the Paris police, a child. Even in this sleepy town, the press had already reached them. Rumour had spread faster than the morning train. A woman with red, work-roughened hands lingered near the door. She looked at him once, then again, and finally approached. "Monsieur Commissaire?" she asked softly. He gestured for her to sit. She perched on the edge of the bench, her eyes uncertain. "I saw a boy," she whispered, "night before the trunk was found. He was standing near the water pump as if waiting for someone. He looked frightened." Maigret did not move, only let the words sink into the heavy silence. "Did he speak to you?" She shook her head. "No. When I asked if he was lost, he ran, toward the tracks." The commissaire's pipe smoke curled upward, mingling with the haze of the stove. He said nothing more, but inside, the conviction tightened. The boy had been here. He had seen something, perhaps too much, and now he fled across Paris with fear as his only companion. That evening he visited the morgue. The corpse lay on a slab, pale under the harsh light. The man was in his 30s, his features coarse, his hands rough. No identification had been found. The local doctor muttered about blows to the head, about suffocation, about death occurring 2 nights before the discovery. Nothing precise, nothing that eased the fog. Maigret stood over the body for a long time, pipe unlit in his hand. He tried to imagine the man alive, boarding trains, carrying trunks, crossing paths with a boy who should have been nowhere near such darkness. He asked himself the question he always asked, not only who killed, but why. The answer hovered beyond reach, like smoke that dissolved before one could grasp it. When he left the morgue, the night air was sharp with frost. The station loomed quiet, the lamps glowing faintly. He walked along the tracks, his heavy step crunching on gravel, his breath steaming. The countryside pressed close, silent, its fields stretching into darkness. And yet even here, in the quiet of the provinces, he felt the echo of pursuit, the sense that unseen eyes followed, that footsteps might sound again in the fog. He returned to his inn, a modest building opposite the station. The room was plain, with peeling wallpaper and a stove that gave more smoke than heat. He sat by the window, pipe at last glowing, and stared at the dark shape of the station across the square. Somewhere the boy had stood, his small shoes leaving marks in the frost, his eyes fixed on the shadows that carried a trunk heavier than its leather sides should allow. The commissaire knew he would not sleep. The silence of the provinces had its own weight, thicker than the clamour of Paris. And in that silence the boy's absence grew louder, as if each tick of the station clock repeated the same refrain. Find him before the city itself swallows him whole. The inn-room was mean and narrow, its wallpaper stained with age, its curtains thin enough to let the cold seep through. A kerosene lamp on the table hissed faintly, its yellow glow throwing long shadows against the walls. Maigret sat heavily in the wooden chair, pipe unlit between his teeth, the silence of the provinces pressing around him. Outside, the muffled sound of the station bell drifted through the night. It was past midnight, and yet he knew sleep would not come. A knock startled him, not sharp, but timid, almost uncertain. He rose slowly, his great frame filling the small space, and opened the door. There, in the dim light of the corridor, stood the boy. Cap in his hands, scarf missing, his hair damp with mist, he looked smaller than Maigret remembered. His eyes, wide and restless, shifted from side to side as though shadows might reach for him. For a moment neither spoke. Then Maigret stepped aside. The boy slipped into the room, shoulders hunched, and stood awkwardly near the bed. The commissaire shut the door with quiet finality, struck a match, and lit his pipe. The glow briefly illuminated the boy's pale face, then faded into the smoke. "You found me," the boy whispered. "No," Maigret said gently. "You found me." The child trembled as if each word cost him strength. He clutched his cap so tightly that the cloth twisted between his fingers. "They'll know I spoke," he murmured. Maigret lowered himself back into the chair, his gaze steady, his tone calm. "Then speak here. No one listens but me." The boy hesitated, swallowed, and sat on the edge of the bed. His shoes barely touched the floor. For a long while he said nothing, the lamp hissing softly, the commissaire's pipe smoke drifting in lazy spirals. Finally, in a voice that faltered but grew steadier with each phrase, he began. "It was at the station, the one here. I was waiting. I don't know why. I think I wanted to see the trains leave. I go sometimes just to watch. People with bags, with flowers, with trunks. I like to imagine where they go." His eyes flickered briefly with something like shame, as though confessing to a childish game. He drew a breath, fingers twisting tighter. That night, I saw him. A man, tall, dark coat. He had a trunk. It looked heavy the way he pulled it. No one wanted to help. The porters turned away. I thought it was strange. Too heavy for clothes, too heavy for one man. The commissaire said nothing, only puffed gently at his pipe. The boy's words filled the silence like drops falling into a still pool. I followed him, just a little, to see where he put it. He left it near the siding, in the dark. He looked around once, twice, as if someone might be watching. I pressed myself against the wall. He didn't see me. When he walked away, I crept closer. I touched the trunk. It was damp, and there was something like a stain on the side. My fingers stuck to it. The boy shuddered, rubbing his hands together as if the memory still clung to his skin. Then he came back. With another man, they spoke low. I couldn't hear the words, only the sound of anger. The second man seemed afraid. He looked over his shoulder like I did. Then they argued. The tall one struck him hard. Not enough to kill, I think, but enough that he staggered. And then they both saw me. His voice broke. He buried his face in his hands, shoulders shaking. Maigret remained motionless, his pipe extinguished now, his eyes steady. He knew better than to rush the silence. He let the boy's breathing steady, let the words gather again. I ran, the child whispered finally. Through the alleys, through the fog. I didn't stop until Paris. I thought if I told you, they wouldn't dare touch me. But when I sat in your office, the words, they stuck. I saw their faces again, the way they looked at me, as if they had already decided what to do with me. He raised his head then, eyes glistening in the lamplight. Now the newspapers talk. They say there was a trunk, that there was a boy. They mean me. Everyone knows they'll find me. They always find people like me. The commissaire leaned forward, elbows on his knees, pipe resting between his fingers. His voice was low, steady, carrying the weight of assurance. You are here now. No one finds you without passing through me. Do you understand? The boy stared, uncertain, but some of the tightness in his shoulders eased. He nodded faintly. What was in the trunk? Maigret asked. Did you know? The boy's face grew pale again. He shook his head quickly, then stopped. Not then, but I knew I could feel it. No clothes are that heavy. The lamp flickered, its flame guttering in the draught. The boy's shadow danced on the wall, thin and fragile. Maigret rose and placed a heavy hand on his shoulder. The child flinched, then slowly stilled beneath the weight of that grip. You did well to come, Maigret said. Better than you think. What you saw is dangerous, yes, but silence would have killed you sooner. You will stay near me now. You will not run. Do you promise? The boy's lips parted, but no sound came. Then, with a trembling breath, he whispered, Yes. They sat together in the yellow lamplight, the commissaire's broad frame and the boy's thin one cast side by side against the stained wallpaper. Outside, the station bell tolled the hour, lonely in the night. Somewhere in the town, men moved in darkness, their eyes sharp, their ears straining for rumor. But here, in this narrow room, a confession had been drawn out, not complete, not whole, but enough to shape the case into something solid. When the boy at last fell asleep on the bed, curled like a child, Maigret remained in the chair, pipe cold, watching the lamp burn low. He knew the hardest part was yet to come. The truth had begun to emerge, jagged and incomplete, but it would drag behind it all the weight of danger. The men the boy had seen would not rest. Silence once broken is never forgiven. As dawn crept faintly across the frosted fields, Maigret rose, stretched his stiff limbs, and looked down at the sleeping child. The boy had spoken, and now the commissaire's duty had deepened. He tamped the lamp, pulled his coat tight, and prepared to meet the day. Paris awaited them both, along with the storm that rumour and confession had set loose. The train bore them back to Paris in the grey of morning. The boy sat opposite Maigret in silence, his eyes fixed on the blurred landscape sliding past the window. Fields rimmed with frost, solitary trees leaning against the wind, villages still asleep under low clouds. He held his cap tightly in both hands, as if it alone anchored him to the world. Now and then he looked toward Maigret, who sat motionless, pipe unlit, his broad frame swaying with the rhythm of the carriage. No words passed between them. There was no need. The confession by lamplight hung between them, fragile and incomplete, yet binding. When they stepped down at the Gare du Nord, the station was alive with the clatter of luggage and the shouts of porters, but to Maigret the noise seemed distant, muffled beneath the weight of what still lay unsolved. He guided the boy with a steady hand at his shoulder, as though shielding him from the rush of travellers. Outside, the fog had returned, curling against the iron pillars and swallowing the outlines of carriages. Paris was waiting, unchanged, indifferent. Back at the Quai des Orfèvres, the familiar smells of damp stone and tobacco greeted them. Lucas and Janvier were waiting, their faces tight with curiosity. They glanced at the boy, then back to their chief, but asked no questions. Maigret led the child into his office, settled him in the same chair where he had first sat days ago, cap twisting between nervous fingers. The symmetry struck Maigret with quiet force. The circle had closed, though the story was not yet ended. He filled his pipe, lit it, and leaned back, studying the boy through the haze. "You will stay here for a time," he said quietly. "Safe. No one touches you under this roof." The boy nodded faintly, though the tension in his shoulders never left. Outside, the rumours had swollen. Newspapers cried louder each morning, each headline more lurid than the last. Child witness in trunk murder, police hide boy at Quai des Orfèvres, Maigret's secret informant. They printed sketches of boys that might have been any child in Paris, invented dialogues, fabricated sightings. Cafes buzzed with speculation. In markets and alleys, whispers spread faster than the wind. Maigret ignored them. He knew better than to chase or deny. He let the noise wash over him, like the clamour of birds over the river, meaningless until silence fell again. In the evenings, when he returned to Boulevard Richard Lenoir, Madame Maigret studied him with quiet concern. She asked nothing, yet her eyes spoke. Once she murmured, "You carry him with you even when you leave him at the office." He did not answer, only smoked in silence, the boy's pale face rising unbidden in his mind. Days passed. The provincial investigation yielded little. The corpse remained nameless. The two men the boy had seen vanished like mist. The trunk in Montmartre still stood, locked once more, holding only silence. The case resisted shape as though it thrived on eluding clarity. But within Maigret a certainty grew. Truth existed, hidden not in documents or telegrams, but in the quiet fragments that clung to the boy's memory. One evening, as the lamps flickered along the embankment, Maigret walked alone by the Seine. The river moved sluggish and dark, its surface broken by the dim reflections of bridges. Barges slid past, their lanterns glowing faintly. He leaned on the parapet, pipe smoke mingling with the fog. Behind him, the city murmured, restless with rumours. Before him the water flowed, indifferent. He thought of all the cases that had crossed his desk, crimes solved, names written neatly in reports, bodies claimed by families or forgotten in paupers' graves. Yet some remained unfinished, lingering in the shadows of his memory. This would be one of them. The boy had spoken enough to confirm what he had seen, but not enough to unmask the men who haunted him. Perhaps he never would. Perhaps silence was the only shield he possessed. And so Maigret accepted what he had always known. Justice was not always neat, truth not always whole. Sometimes the river carried secrets too heavy to lift, and all a man could do was bear witness. The boy remained at the Quai des Orfèvres for several more days, a quiet presence in the corners of the office. He ate little, spoke less, yet his eyes followed every movement of the commissaire as if drawing strength from his solid calm. Then one morning, without fanfare, arrangements were made. A provincial cousin was found, distant but willing, who would take him in. Papers were signed, a train ticket purchased. The boy departed with no luggage but his cap, no farewell, but a brief glance back at the heavy-set figure smoking in the doorway. Maigret watched until the train pulled out, its smoke trailing like a ribbon against the grey sky. He knew he might never see the boy again. Yet he also knew the child's silence, his whispered confession, would remain with him always, like the lingering taste of tobacco on his tongue. That evening, at home, Madame Maigret served stew in their modest dining room. The lamp glowed warmly, the lace curtains stirred with the draught, and the ordinary sounds of their life resumed. He ate slowly, savouring the domestic peace. Yet in the quiet he felt the echo of the case, unfinished, unresolved, belonging now to the city's fog and the river's flow. Later, as he tamped his pipe by the window, he saw the lamps of Paris stretching into the night, each halo blurred by mist. The city lived on, indifferent to whispers and corpses, to rumours and silences. But for Maigret, the case of the boy who knew too much had etched itself deep, not for its crime alone, but for the fragile, trembling figure who had carried truth, heavier than any trunk. The Seine flowed dark and steady, bearing secrets toward the sea. Maigret stood watching, his broad silhouette framed in the glow of the lamp, pipe smoke curling upward, like a final question left unanswered. And in the hush of the city's heart, he felt once more the weight of footsteps in the fog, echoes of a story that would never wholly leave him.